Hi everybody out in the world of YouTube. This is Andrew Cuneo here with a new video. Today I want to go over the Streets of New Capenna charms that have been previewed. But before we do that, I thought it would be interesting and useful to kind of go through a history of charms throughout the history of Magic to look at which ones have been successful in constructed decks and which ones have kind of flopped, to see if we can gain some insights that will help to evaluate the charms, or at least give some hints as to how we might expect the charms to be useful. So with that, let's take a trip down memory lane and jump all the way back to Mirage, which came out in 1996. For people who don't know, Mirage is a pretty important set in the history of Magic because in a lot of ways, Mirage kind of laid the groundwork for what would come to be the standard structure of a Magic set. Before that, there had been big expansions and there'd been small expansions, but they didn't really kind of follow any kind of consistent rules. And with Mirage, we saw basically the development of the initial block structure, which has since gone away, but also just the idea that you would get a big set, and the big set would kind of define its own world, and it would kind of be something that was self-contained, but also be designed to play with the other sets around it. So one of the things that Mirage did to kind of help set the trends for sets to come in the future was it was the first set that had charms. And it laid out this framework that is carried through to this day, where a charm is an instant. It gives you 3 options at instant speed, and you get to choose one of those options when you cast it. So it's versatile, it's instant speed, and it's not necessarily the most powerful effects in the world. In fact, they're oftentimes pretty small effects. And so here's an example, Chaos Charm, which you can give a creature haste. You can deal a damage to a creature, or you could destroy a wall. This card didn't see any competitive play. None of those abilities were good enough on rate, and that kind of held true for all of the charms in Mirage. None of them were really particular standouts or particularly noteworthy, but the next set, Visions, actually had the first charm that made an impact on Constructed, and that's this card, Emerald Charm, which you could untap a permanent. That was not an important mode of the card. Destroy target global enchantment, which global enchantment is a wording that's not used anymore, but it basically means destroy a non-aura enchantment. And it was doing this for 1 mana, which at the time, and even to this day, a card, if you are interested in blowing up one of your opponent's enchantments and you can get to do it for a single green mana, that's a really good deal. So this was not really a main deck card, but it did show up in people's sideboards, and it's the first time we actually had a charm having an effect in competitive Magic, so that's pretty noteworthy. Then we didn't see any charms for quite a while. It wasn't until 2001 where we saw the return of charms with Plane Shift, and this is the first time we get to see a multicolored charm. There were 5 dragons in Plane Shift, and each one of them had a corresponding charm. So this was Darragaz's charm, and it cost a black, a red, and a green mana, so 3 mana up from 1 mana, and 3 different colors of mana, so it was pretty expensive and pretty hard to cast. And the choices you got were you could return a card from your graveyard to your hand, which is Raise Dead. You could deal 3 damage to a creature or player, which is Lightning Bolt. Or you could give a creature +3/+3 until end of turn, which is Giant Growth. So that corresponds to the abilities that you would have gotten in the original Magic set for a black, a red, or a green mana. And none of those abilities are competitive enough on rate, so this card really didn't see any play. So it kind of shows one of the pitfalls that you can fall into when you're looking at charms, where if you're paying too high of a premium on flexibility, you just wind up with a card where none of the modes are actually attractive to cast, and that's what you got with Darragaz's charm. There was, none of the charms had a huge impact on Constructed. There was this one, though, Rith's Charm, that you could destroy a non-basic land, you could put 3/1/1 saplings into play, or you could prevent all damage of a source of your choice for 1 turn. And this is noteworthy in the sense that it's an instant. Actually being able to destroy your opponent's land with a spell at instant speed was something that was, I don't know if it had even existed at all up to this point in Magic. So it was certainly an unusual effect. And also just putting 3/1/1s into play for 3 mana at instant speed, that's not a horrible rate. So this card, I actually played with this a little bit in IPA Block Constructed. It wasn't really a top tier deck, but it was good enough that it saw kind of fringe play. And I think the thing that made it usable was that the effects you were getting, like 3 mana to destroy a land, was about on par with what you might have paid on a spell at that point in time. Certainly, if you're ever paying 2 mana to destroy a land in Magic, that's generally a really good deal. And if you're paying 4 mana, you're getting a bad deal. 3 mana is kind of the point at which it's maybe appealing. And so that was not too bad on rate on this card. And then making 3/1/1s at instant speed for 3 mana is something that it wouldn't be a slam dunk to see play if it existed at this point, but it also would have a chance if it could find the right deck. So it basically the IPA or Invasion Planeshift era charms, none of them were huge hits, but they did sort of lay the groundwork for what would come in the future, where we would see these multicolored charms where the effects you were getting were more powerful. But I think that the designers hadn't really quite found the right point to hit in terms of power level for them to be cards people were actually excited to play. In 2002, Onslaught brought another cycle of charms that were really pretty reminiscent of like the Mirage Visions era charms, where it was a single mana in each of the different colors, and you got 3 abilities, none of which were particularly good. So here, Piety Charm's an example. You could destroy target enchant creature that's an aura that's enchanting a creature. You could give a soldier +2/+2 until end of turn, so a really narrow combat trick, or you could give a creature vigilance until end of turn. So 3 pretty weak abilities, and this is kind of representative of what all the charms are like. So none of these really saw any competitive play. They were maybe more successful at limited cards, but really they were a callback to the Mirage era charms, which were not particularly effective or impactful. And then there's a bit of a gap until Time Spiral. Time Spiral came out in 2006. And here we saw Funeral Charm. And this is actually, Time Spiral block is one of the most interesting blocks in the history of Magic. So in Time Spiral, there was an additional rare in each pack, which was a time-shifted card. It kind of functioned similar to how Strixhaven Mystical Archives functioned, in that it was just a straight-up reprint that didn't even necessarily tie into what was going on in the set directly. And here we've got Funeral Charm. This is a reprint of a charm from Visions. And this is not a great card. It's target player discards a card, or you give a creature +2/-1 until end of turn, or you give a creature Swamp Walk. And it's interesting, I guess, for two reasons. One is that you could make your opponent discard at instant speed, which means that you can kind of lock them out of their draw step if you get them to the point where they're empty-handed. So this saw a little bit of play in like really heavy discard decks. Also, if you were concerned about people having 1 toughness creatures, this was a way to kill them for 1 mana. So this was a fringe playable card, but not a home run. It's a little bit interesting in that this is the first set, I believe, where we saw a charm appear and it wasn't part of a cycle of charms. They only chose to reprint one of the charms. But then the next year we had Planar Chaos, and here there was a full cycle of charms, and Planar Chaos is part of Time Spiral block. It's a really unusual set in the history of Magic where the whole theme of the set was it broke the color wheel. So here we have Piracy Charm, which is in a lot of ways just a straight ripoff of Funeral Charm, but instead of being a black card, it's a blue card. So instead of giving Swamp Walk, it gives Island Walk, but otherwise it's the exact same card. And there's a whole cycle of charms from the set that kind of do the same thing, where they do abilities that you wouldn't necessarily usually associate with that color. This card actually saw some competitive play in Modern and perhaps even in Legacy. Tom Ross, who is really well known for popularizing blue-green style infect decks in those formats, would frequently sideboard this card because it was a blue way to kill a 1 toughness creature. And he wanted a way, kind of honestly, just to have an advantage if he had to play the Infect Mirror, where, if you aren't familiar with those old Infect decks, they relied really heavily on having a 1 toughness creature that had Infect in play. So if your opponent just had a 1 mana way to kill your creature, it was a pretty big deal. And so this is yet, I guess this is really the second example of a card that just really kind of found a home in competitive constructed decks. Again, it was a sideboard card, but it was it was something that really did find a home. And it wasn't so much for its flexibility, but it was more for the fact that it gave access to an ability that you might not normally have, or you wouldn't have had at that rate, or in this case, you wouldn't have had in this color combination. The ability to kill a creature for 1 blue mana at instant speed is something that doesn't often exist in Magic, so that was really what made this one stand out. Moving on to 2008, and this is perhaps the first time that Charms really, really hit in Constructed. We had Shards of Alara, and this was a return to the 3-color Charms. But here it's a little bit different in that you were actually getting a reasonable rate on some of the abilities. So Jund Charm was one of the more successful ones. It had exile all cards from a player's graveyard. That wasn't that big of a deal. That saw a little bit of use in spots where graveyard hate was really at a premium. But deal 2 damage to each creature, and you remember you're doing this at instant speed. So that's an effect that it's printed on cards to this day, like Cinderclasm, and it sees a little bit of play when the format has a lot of low toughness creatures in it. And here we're getting on a card that also has some other modes, and the third mode is put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature, which that's a mode you would never play a card like that in Constructed just for that mode, but when situations arise where it's useful, it's a very, very powerful mode to have access to on a card that has other flexibility. So Jund Charm was a successful Constructed card, probably between that and this other one, Esper Charm, these were the 2 most successful charms up to this point in Magic. Esper Charm was 3 mana, draw 2 cards at instant speed, which to this day, 3 mana, draw 2 cards at instant speed is a very good rate for any sort of controlling deck. Then you could also make your opponent discard 2 cards, and remember this is at instant speed, so if they had 1 card in their hand at the start of their turn, you could kind of get their entire hand inside their draw step, which is a really, really effective way to kind of press an advantage. And then destroy an enchantment, which that was perhaps the most fringe mode on the card, but it certainly, when it matters a lot. Destroying an enchantment for 3 mana is not super appealing. You were mostly playing this card because you could draw 2 cards or make your opponent discard 2 cards. So like I said, the Shards of Alara was perhaps the first time that Charms really made a big mark as kind of main deck cards in competitive decks. Then there was a bit of a gap until we saw Charms again. We saw them in 2012 and in 2013 with Return to Ravnica and Gatecrash. And this is perhaps the heyday of Charms in competitive Magic. I'm not actually going to go over all of the ones that saw Constructed play because so many of them were used. Azorius Charm was perhaps the most important one in that standard. It was, if you remember, the Sphinx's Revelation, Elixir of Immortality decks. Azorius Charm was the 2 mana removal spell of choice because it had this 2 mana put an attacking or blocking creature on top of its owner's library, so reminiscent of like an Ether Gust style card. And so 2 mana to get a creature off the board that's a competitive rate in Constructed for sure. And then the thing that made it so good was this other mode, 2 mana, just draw a card, which that's essentially 2 mana cycle. And that's not a great rate, but that's also not an awful rate. Even to this day, if you look in Historic, people will play Irrigated Farmland in their blue-white control deck, which has 2 mana cycle to get a new card. So clearly, if the rest of your deck is efficient enough, having 2 mana cycling on some of your cards is fine, especially if they're cards that their primary use is going to be something that you're excited about. Which in this case, it was the 2 mana put an attacking or blocking creature on top of the opponent's library. That was the good part of this card. The cycling part was the part that made it just kind of a mainstay that you're happy to play 4 of in your deck. And then there's also this ability that Creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. That was not a super important ability on the card, but there were situations where the way that deck won, it had an Elspeth Planeswalker that made a ton of 1/1s. And if your life total had gotten really low, but you had stabilized and had a ton of 1/1s, you could just give them all lifelink to get your life total to a completely safe position to put the game away. So that mattered some of the time too. Moving on to another charm, we've got Golgari Charm, where here this was more of a sideboard card, but the important modes were giving all creatures -1/-1 until end of turn could be a very effective sweeper against decks that just had a lot of low toughness creatures, like a Weenie Rush deck. And then regenerate each creature you control mattered a lot because the best sweeper of the day was Supreme Verdict, which destroyed all creatures, so you could use Golgari Charm to counter that. And then destroying an enchantment for 2 mana, again, that's not the most important mode on the card, but it mattered sometimes. I would say that this is a really unusual card in the terms of these charm cycle, where it was a sideboard card, but here the versatility of it, you weren't really boarding it in to have a versatile card in a given matchup. You knew which mode you were going to cast when you boarded it into your deck, or which mode you were planning to cast, 95% of the time. But because of the versatility of the card, it sort of served as a sideboard card you could board in two very, very different styles of matchups. So here the versatility was not really, it wasn't paying you off in terms of giving you a versatile options in the gameplay. It was giving you effectively extra sideboard slots because it was such a versatile sideboard card. Selesnya Charm was another one. This one was more of a main deck card, and none of the modes were actually that great on the card. The exile a creature with power 5 or greater was perhaps the most mana efficient mode on the card, and that was a big part of why it saw play. The other good mode was create a 2/2 white Knight Vigilance token, which that might not seem like that was that great on rate because it really isn't, but the way the white-green decks worked, they relied on a mechanic where if you had a token in play, your token would get copied by a lot of your spells. So it was important to be able to just consistently make a token creature in that deck, and that was part of why this card saw play. And then giving creature +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. Like I said on Jund Charm, that's never going to be the mode that kind of makes or breaks the charms, but it is a mode where if you've got a card that's otherwise playable and you start putting a combat trick like this in your deck, it really changes the way people have to play against you when your creatures get in combat and constructed. Normally in constructed, you don't really need to play around combat tricks. You don't need to respect them because your opponent's just not going to have them in their deck. But when a combat trick is attached to a versatile card that's going to be in their deck anyway, it does make it so you actually can't just, ignore any possibility of combat tricks out of the deck. You have to respect that they can have them, and you have to play around them. And then finally, we have Boros Charm, which is probably the card that it's the charm from the cycle that's had the most staying power, and that's because this mode of 2 mana deal 4 damage to a player or a planeswalker is just so great on rate. Dealing 4 damage to a player at instant speed for 2 mana that's just the best thing you can do on rate if you're looking for a burn spell. That was the thing that really, really made this card have a lot of staying power. There was also this kind of weird combo that some decks would use where they would give their creatures indestructible, specifically Boros Reckoner, and you could kind of set up a really complicated infinite combo that gained infinite life. That was not really the biggest part of this card. The biggest part was definitely just Boros' Charm, dealing 4 damage that in burn decks. That's why this card has remained, and it kind of goes to show that on a charm, if one of the modes is just really good on rate, that's enough to carry the card, and that's what happened here. Then, the very next year, 2014, we saw a return of 3 color charms, and this also had a bunch of really strong charms. Here we had a Jeskai Charm, where this was one of the charms where really you used all 3 modes somewhat frequently. So put a creature on top of its opponent's library. That's That's not great, but for 3 mana, it certainly would, there'd be times you'd want to do it. 4 damage to an opponent, that's very reminiscent of Boros Charm. And then giving all your creatures +1/+1 and lifelink until end turn. This was perhaps the narrowest of modes on the card, but this went in a deck with the card Manus Rider that was like a 3/3 flyer. So if you had a couple of those in play, you could generate really huge life swings by giving them all +1/+1 and lifelink. So all 3 modes mattered on this card, and they I wouldn't say they mattered all in equal parts. Probably the 4 damage was the most important mode. But this is an unusual charm in that you really were getting the benefit of all 3 modes. The same thing was kind of true with Absent Charm also. For people who don't remember, this was the standard where Siege Rhino was running around. It was just kind of everywhere. And so exiling a creature with power 3 or greater was the primary mode on this card. It was a very important mode on this card. Also, draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. I said this before with, I believe, Esper Charm, but drawing 2 cards at instant speed for 3 mana is just inherently a pretty good deal in any sort of mid-range or controlling deck. And here you're losing 2 life, which it matters, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. Especially just having instant speed card draw in a non-blue deck is a pretty big deal, as we've seen in Alchemy now with Painful Bond. This is a much worse rate than what you get with Painful Bond, but this is still a perfectly reasonable card. And then here we have another thing. This is better than a combat trick. It's just distributing counters, so it lasts and it can target more than one spell. So this was one where you really had to respect. If you were going to be getting into combat with your opponent's creatures, you needed to respect this mode on the card where it was distributing counters, because here, if they could, if they were going to win a combat and they were going to get to keep a creature that was going to be an even bigger problem going forward, that was a huge deal. So this is just another example of a charm where all 3 modes really were useful, and that, I think, is what propelled it to just see a ton of play. This was it was pretty much a 4 of in all of the Siege Rhino decks for the duration of the format. Then, after the success of Return to Ravnica and Cons of Tarkir, we saw a really big gap where there were no charms. Not until 2019 did charms make a return, and here they made a return in Modern Horizons, and they didn't even come as part of a bigger cycle. So this is the first time we had charms not as a cycle since Time Spiral. And we've got this card, Archmage's Charm, which is a really important card in Historic. It's been an important card in Modern. And it has kind of the same structure that has made other charms really important, which is that it's an instant speed, draw 2 cards on a spell that has other modes that are good. And I think that is kind of the really one of the most important things to make one of these cards good, is that the flexibility matters in the gameplay, because you can decide to leave it up past the turn to your opponent, see what they do with their turn. And if they've done something that makes one of the other modes appealing, which here counter a spell is obviously a really appealing mode a lot of the time. Gain control of a 1 mana permanent is also a really appealing mode a lot of the time. But if neither of those modes wind up being appealing, you haven't wasted your mana by leaving up access to this. You can just spend 3 mana, draw your 2 cards, and move on with the game. And you've done something that's pretty efficient with your turn. So the Archmage's Charm it remains one of the absolute best cards in Historic, and I haven't played a ton of Modern, but I think it's still a card that matters in Modern. It's perhaps not at the very top tier in Modern, but it does still matter. And that was so we've kind of had a drought of charms from their heyday in like 2012 to 2014. To then we've got this one entry at 2019, and now it's 2022, and we're finally getting to see a return of the charms. So let's go through them and see how we can apply what we've learned from going through this, this history of charms. So we're going to be looking for individual modes that are where you're getting a reasonable deal on rate. We're going to be looking for effects that you normally wouldn't be getting on you wouldn't normally be getting on a card where you could do it at instant speed. I think those are the 2 big takeaways. Is you need at least one really efficient mode where you're paying an appropriate amount of mana, or on some of these charms that really hit, you're honestly getting a good deal. but you need to have at least one mode where you're getting a reasonable deal in terms of how much mana you're spending. Obviously, with the multicolored charms, they're a little bit harder to cast than a single colored 3 CMC card or 3 mana value card. So even a reasonable deal, you are paying a little bit more in terms of expense to be able to cast the card. But that's something that if you're putting them in your deck, you should have constructed your mana base with the idea that you're going to try to be casting these cards that are hard to cast. So that is a cost you kind of pay in deck building, not so much once you get into the game. And then the other thing, like I said, that we're going to be looking for is, do they provide some unique abilities at instant speed? You know, can they act as an instant speed sweeper against specific decks, or can they destroy a class of permanents that's hard to destroy, or can they make your opponent discard cards during their draw step? Those were all abilities that we saw that mattered. So let's go over the charms and see if any of the abilities stand out as things that are going to make the charms really prove to be good competitive constructed cards. So let's start with Broker's Charm, which I guarantee at some point I'm going to refer to as Bonker's Charm. And that's not really because the card is all that bonkers, but it's just a pretty easy mistake to make, I guess. So here we have, we've got last ability, instant speed, draw 2 cards. So we know from looking at the other charms, that's an ability that is a pretty strong indicator that this is going to be a good charm. So are either of the other abilities things we're going to be interested in? 3 mana, destroy target enchantment. So you're definitely not getting a good rate to destroy an enchantment. I would say that for destroying an enchantment, you're hoping to pay 2 mana. I mean, you'd be excited if you're paying 1 mana and you're in a matchup where destroying enchantments is good. At 3 mana, it can't be the main usage of this card. It's going to be a fringe usage. So then we get to the first ability. I've done them in reverse order. I don't know why. But the first ability is +1/+0, and your creature deals damage to a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. So this card's a little bit reminiscent of Blizzard Brawl, which, a fully charged up Blizzard Brawl, you're going to be getting +1/+0, and you're going to be winning a fight when you have Indestructible. This is slightly different, but it's kind of reminiscent of that. And here you're paying 3 mana, but you are getting to do it at instant speed. 3 mana fight or punch at instant speed is not really a great rate, but you can hit planeswalkers with it. I think this card it's not a clear slam dunk that it's going to be great, but the fact that it has draw 2 cards on it does make it good enough that I think you're going to need to strongly consider it in any deck that's going to be capable of casting it, which it's not clear that there's going to be a Bant deck at all. If there's a Bant deck that's playing creatures, this is a card that you should at least experiment with. But if I had to guess, I would guess this is not going to be a 4-of mainstay. I could be wrong, though. Certainly, 3 mana, draw 2 cards at instant speed is the right start for a card. Moving on to Cabaretti Charm is how I'm going to say this. I have no idea how you're supposed to say it. So we got the first mode. You deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. This is not a very good effect to have on a card. There's a land that, a white land, Kabira Crossroads. I don't know what it's called on the back. That does the same ability for 2 mana, and every once in a while people put it in their deck, but this really isn't a very good ability. Then we've got creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. Not a good ability for 3 mana. Really not a good ability at all. And create 2 1/1 green and white creature tokens for 3 mana at instant speed. And if you remember all the way back to Riveteers Charm at the start of this video, that one was giving us 3 1/1 creatures at instant speed. Here we've been downgraded to 2 1/1 green and white creatures. So I would say this charm really does not look promising to me at all. All 3 of the abilities are just overcosted for what you're getting. I would say like the first and the third ability, even if you're getting that at 2 mana in constructed, it's not really a particularly good deal. At 2 mana, maybe if there was some sort of great synergy with what your deck was doing, you would consider it. At 3 mana, it's not going to be appealing. And then the middle ability, I don't think that would be appealing even at 1 mana in competitive constructed. So this one looks like a limited only card, basically. Maestros Charm. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. Put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. That's not a great effect for 3 mana. 3 mana kind of dig for 1 card. You know, you're not up on cards. You've just done a little bit of selection. That's not particularly good. Although one thing that is interesting, this card does put the other 4 cards into your graveyard. So maybe if you're trying to do a reanimation strategy, this could be a good way to get the creatures into your graveyard. This is not a good ability just on its own on rate. You have to really care about the cards going to your graveyard, and then maybe it's acceptable on rate. Second ability, each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. So you can't kill a creature with that ability. It's just drain for 3. That is not a good ability on rate for 3 mana. And then 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker. You're mostly going to get to kill what you want to kill, but for 3 mana, you should really, like, you could play with Hero's Downfall right now, and you would just get to kill what you wanted to kill. So that is not particularly appealing. None of the modes on this card seem good enough to me. Certainly the middle mode. I mean, the middle mode's not even close. The third mode, you're getting a bit of a bad deal. The first mode is perhaps the most promising of modes, but again, I think you should only have that in a deck where you really care about getting cards in your graveyard. So maybe if that kind of deck exists, or if you're trying to make that deck exist, you might be interested in this. But outside of this, outside of that specific deck, I don't think that this is a very appealing card. Obscura Charm. So this is the Esper one. First ability, return target multicolored permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. That's a pretty powerful ability, assuming that you have multicolored permanents that meet that requirement, that you would be excited to get into play. The one that springs to mind immediately is Kaito, the ninja planeswalker. I think is the best 3 CMC multicolored permanent we've got in Standard or Alchemy right now. And even at that point, like, getting that back for 3 mana, you're not really getting a deal. You're just kind of you're getting a reasonable price. You're not cheating anything at that point. You're just getting a reasonable price. So that could be useful. That's not, I don't think, good enough to have the card wind up being a mainstay. But let's look at the other abilities. Counter an instant or sorcery spell. So this isn't exactly negate. I guess this is more like Test of Talents, but without the extra upside, and you are paying an extra mana. So you are overpaying for that mode for sure. But that is a mode that is just consistently actually pretty good in Constructed. So I would say that is somewhat appealing. And then the third ability, destroy a creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. So here, that's something that I think you could get for 2 mana if you wanted it, and you're paying 3 mana instead here, so you're overpaying a little bit. All in all, I would say this card it's going to be appealing for people that can use the first mode of the card. So whether you're playing Kaito, or whether you find, I don't know, maybe you're a Triumphant Adventurer deck in Alchemy, or maybe you find just some other cards in Streets of New Capenna that you're interested in using that mode on. Certainly, if you identify a multicolored permanent that's mana value 3 or less, and you think it's really, really key to your deck, and you want to get redundancy for that permanent into your deck, this would be a way to do that. So I think this card, it's got a chance for sure. It's really just going to depend on if your deck can make good use of the first mode. And we come to the last one, Riveteers Charm. So this is the Jund variant, and we've got target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker they control with the highest mana value among the creatures or planeswalkers they control. So I believe that this is exactly Soul Shatter, which is a card that sees a little bit of play, and it costs 3 mana. So you're getting just Soul Shatter that is more color intensive to cast. So right away, that's a reasonable ability. Second ability, exile the top 3 cards of your library until your next instep, you can play those cards. So you can cast it as an instant on your opponent's turn and then have access to the cards. I mean, if you have a lot of mana and you play it as an instant, you hit other instants, you could play an instant on your opponent's turn that you got off of it, and then also on your turn play a land and maybe play a sorcery. In general, your deck's going to have enough lands in it that there's going to be a lot of cases where you cannot actually cast all 3 cards because you just hit 2 lands. And unless you've done something that allows you to play multiple lands in a turn, you're never going to be able to play both lands off of this. So this is not really a draw 3. But, this card, it's reminiscent of Expressive Iteration, although you're forced to use all of the cards immediately or you're going to lose them. You can't get a card into your hand and save it for later, so it's a little bit less flexible. But I think that this is very reminiscent of all of the instant speed draw 2s we've seen. In some ways, this is better than an instant speed draw 2 because you're just getting to see more cards, and there are going to be times when you get to use all 3 cards. It's not guaranteed. It's going to have a wider range. There's certainly more upside, but there are going to be times when you don't get an effect as good as draw 2 cards. But as we've identified on a lot of the charms in the history of Magic, draw 2 cards at instant speed, especially on a card that you would be interested in, just leaving up and waiting to see if you want to use one of the other modes. That is a good way for one of these cards to be extremely good. So I think right away we've got 2 modes that are pretty appealing on this card. And then the third mode, exile the player's graveyard. That's really just going to depend on if you're playing a format where graveyards matter. I don't think that there's a reason to believe that Standard or Alchemy is really going to be a heavily graveyard-dependent format, so I don't know that mode's really going to matter very much. There might be matchups where it matters a lot, but that is not going to be the reason that you put this card in your deck. It's just going to be a little bit of a nice bonus. If you're playing Historic, and Historic being able to hate out your opponent's graveyard does matter a lot. I don't know that either of the other 2 modes are efficient enough that you would actually be looking to play this card in Historic. But maybe this card is part of the piece of the puzzle that makes Jund midrange something that people actually try to play in Historic. Certainly, being able to get incidental graveyard hate into your deck in Historic is just a good thing all around. And so maybe that makes this card somewhat interesting in Historic. I would say that Riveteers Charm is probably my pick for the charm that I think will be the most impactful in Standard. Broker's Charm, I think there's got a little bit of possibility. Obscura Charm, I think is maybe my pick for the second most likely one to succeed. Maestros Charm, it's going to depend on if there's a graveyard-based deck, and then Cabaretti Charm, I would say no shot at all. That one's just not going to be good. So I hope you found this useful. It's, half spoiler video, half historical retrospective, which I had fun making it. I had a good time looking through the history of all these charms. So if you liked the video, please leave a comment. Please sub to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.